Good afternoon. My name is Paulo Sotero. I am the former director of the Brazil Institute and a distinguished fellow at the Wilson Center. I'm doing the honors here for one particular reason. I was the director when Ben came as a fellow, and he spent 8 months with us from December of 18 until July of 19. So for me, it's a personal pleasure to welcome Ben to do this presentation on the book Precarious Democracy. He worked on that book in part when he was at the Wilson Center. So welcome back, Ben. Also, I'd like to welcome Patricia Pinho from the University of California in Santa Cruz, Moisés Copper, who is with the L'Université Libre de Bruxelles, Deborah Diniz, anthropologist and law professor at the University of Brasilia and co-founder of and researcher at the Institute of Bioethics. I'm sorry, I'm having a little serious eye problem, and it takes me a while to read things. But let me talk just briefly about Ben's work, published in book format just earlier this year by Rutgers University Press. The last decade in Brazil has underscored the fragility of many of the socioeconomic gains witnessed earlier this century. Unemployment and poverty are high, and inflation is surging. Even before COVID-19, the COVID-19 pandemic hit, an increasing number of Brazilians were facing an uncertain economic future. Yet much of the analysis has focused on the macro level trend policy reforms and national level partisan battles, glossing over the individual experiences of Brazilians across the country. This new work by Ben Junge, professor at the university in New York University, fills the gap and brings a richer context. The title, as I mentioned, is Precarious Democracy, Ethnographies of Hope, Despair, and Resistance in Brazil. As I mentioned, Ben finalized the work as a fellow at the Wilson Center in late 18, first half of 19. And it is a great pleasure to welcome Ben back to the Wilson Center, along with the discussants and commentators for this session. So, Ben, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Paulo. Good afternoon, everyone. Boa tarde. I should also say bom dia, boa noite, because we have people at various time zones. So thank you so much to the Wilson Center for International Scholars for sponsoring this event. I have really fond memories of my fellowship year at the Wilson Center. It was only 3 years ago, but it feels like a lifetime ago. And it's great to reconnect with Paulo Sotero, Anya Prusa, and the other folks from the Brazil Institute. I also want to acknowledge my home institution, the State University of New York at New Paltz, and also my home away from home institution, where I'm lucky enough to be on a sabbatical year right now at the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Okay, let me share my screen. Just want to make sure. Okay, great. All right, so this book, and right now would be a good time, Barbara, if you could paste in the text in the chat. There's a bit of information about the book that's being pasted into the chat right now. So this book that, as Paulo has mentioned, it's called Precarious Democracy, Ethnographies of Hope, Despair, and Resistance in Brazil. It was released earlier this year, just a few months ago. I want to acknowledge our editor at Rutgers University Press, Kimberly Guinta, who has been a pleasure to work with. I forgive the shameless promotion there. I like to mention always that there is a discount. This is a relatively inexpensive book. If you put in that code at the Rutgers University website for the book, you can get it for less than $30. So I encourage you to have a look if you're interested. I also want to acknowledge my co-editors. There are three of them. They are Sean Mitchell from Rutgers University Newark, Alvaro Harim from the College of the Holy Cross, and Lucia Cantero from the University of San Francisco. I'm also going to acknowledge Professora Karina Biondi, who is from the Universidade Estadual de Maranhão, who is joining us as a co-editor on the Portuguese version of the book, which we're hoping will be out in just a few months in early 22. That'll be with the publisher Zuki in Porto Alegre. So stay tuned for that. I also want to just briefly mention before continuing who we dedicated this book to. And we dedicated it to the anthropologist John Burdick, who passed away in 2020. And his work on gender, race, religion, and social movements has been an inspiration to all of us, and we miss him a lot. So acknowledgement to John. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a quick introduction to the book, what it has in it, and also the context and vision behind the book. And I'm going to do all of that in 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll move on to our two presenters and our discussant. Okay, so broadly speaking, Precarious Democracy examines how Brazilians from diverse walks of life have experienced and responded to economic precarity, political crisis, and diminishing hopes for the future from 2013 to 2019, a pivotal period in Brazilian history, bookended by the explosion of massive protests across the country in 2013, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the first year in office of hard-right President Jair Bolsonaro. Okay, as our chapters show in the book, these were years not only of deepening cynicism about institutional politics and democracy itself, but also years of new forms of hope and resistance with transformative promise for the future. Hold on just a moment. Let's see if this is working. Just a second, apologies. Let me pull that up again. All right, so forgive all of the detail and fine print here. You do not need to read this, all of this. This is the table of contents to the volume, and it's really meant to just give you a sense of the variety of themes and people that are here. The book is made up of a substantive introduction that the four editors wrote together. Then we have a second introductory chapter, which is a critical overview written by the Brazilian anthropologist historian Lilia Schwartz. We're very happy and grateful to have her on board on this project. And then we have 16 substantive chapters, each one written by a different anthropologist. In some cases, there are more than one author for the chapters. I'm not going to read all of them to you, but you get a sense of the range here. We're proud to have diversity in terms of our authors with respect to gender, race, and nationality. We're especially proud to have over half of our authors are Brazilian anthropologists. We divide the chapters into 4 sections. Thematically, the intimacy of power, corruption and crime, infrastructures of hope, and old challenges, new activism. I myself have a chapter in this book, which I wrote while at the Wilson Center, and which presents an ethnographic account of intergenerational tensions in a working class family from Recife as the 2018 presidential elections got closer. In a few more minutes, 2 authors here that you can see here in the table of contents, Patricia Pinho and Moisés Copper, will present highlights and pieces of their chapters. Before that, however, I would like to read a couple of brief passages from the book's introduction, which map out the context and vision for the project. And I'm turning off my slides to do that. Okay. So we put the finishing touches on this volume just a few months ago in May. And at that moment, we wrote the following, quote, "With Brazil in the grips of the devastating COVID-19 pandemic, it is difficult to find words for the extraordinary transformations to the country's political, economic, and affective landscapes that characterized the past decade. A decade ago, Brazil seemed poised to become a global economic and political power, and the country was hailed worldwide as an example of successful progressive governance. During the 2-term presidency of Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva of the Leftist Workers' Party, or PT, from 2003 to 2010, some 30 million people had exited poverty as the poor and working classes saw an enormous expansion of opportunities for educational, economic, and geographic mobility. When Lula completed his 2nd term in office in 2010, he had an 87% approval rating and was widely credited for having steered the country around the global economic crisis. On these laurels, many pundits assumed that the next decade would bring continued reduction of poverty and inequality and a deepening of progressive governance to this brutally unequal nation. And indeed, the overall economic trends characterizing the Lula years continued during the 1st term of his PT successor, Dilma Rousseff. These days, however, Brazil looks radically different. Even before COVID, many of the social gains of the previous decade had been dismantled. Brazil's economy had sunk to 9th place globally in terms of gross domestic product. 4.5 million people had fallen into extreme poverty. Moreover, in 2019, Brazil became the democratic country with the world's highest concentration of income among the top 1%. While Brazil's successes during the first decade of the 21st century were real, a range of submerged social antagonisms later became devastatingly apparent. The rising fortunes of poor and working classes under PT governance threatened the established position and prestige for elites and middle classes in the long-standing class hierarchy. Simultaneously, the rising profile of LGBTQ, feminist, Black, and Indigenous movements increasingly provoked sometimes vicious forms of conservative backlash. Additionally, the waning of the commodities boom that was fueled by Chinese demand revealed certain structural limits of the PT era growth model, precipitating economic crisis and emboldening opponents of the PT. Meanwhile, even in the midst of poverty reduction, long-standing problems of crime, political corruption, deficient public services, and environmental destruction fueled popular discontent. Great. excellent. All of this created opportunities for conservative, political, and religious actors that had been organizing, growing, and cementing international alliances during the long period of left-wing governance. Few now view Brazil as a formidable emerging international power, despite its planetary environmental significance. Between April 2018 and November 2019, Lula was imprisoned under politically motivated charges to remove him from running in the presidential election for which he was leading the polls. Riven by violent political polarization, Brazil has seen the rise of a vast far-right movement capable of marshaling massive political and electoral support, somewhat paradoxically, even among those populations who most benefited under PT governments. Just wrapping up my comments. It's hard to see what the future holds for Brazil, but our volume attempts to understand these crucial transitional years for the nation and add ethnographic, anthropological depth to our understanding of the major shifts that Brazil has undergone during this period. One of the most powerful attributes of ethnography is its ability to show us how different people experience and make sense of the crisis and social transformation. Precarious Democracy provides no definite answers for why and how Brazil shifted as it did, although we develop several hypotheses in our chapters, nor do we claim we can predict what the future holds. Rather, in conclusion, through a close examination of the experiences, narratives, affects, and actions of people from many perspectives who lived through this period, Precarious Democracy aspires to be an enduring account of life under conditions of political and economic precarity and unpredictable political change. So that concludes my comments, my introduction, and what happens next is I will pass the baton to Professor Patricia Pinho, and who has already been introduced briefly. She's Associate Professor of Latin American and Latino Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And she's going to present some work from her chapter, which is called Whiteness Has Come Out of the Closet and Intensified Brazil's Reactionary Wave. Patricia.
Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to start by sharing my screen, so just bear with me for 1 second. Okay, so I'd like to start by thanking the co-editors of this really important volume. It's a real pleasure to be here alongside Moises and Ben, and also to have, the honor of having Deborah Janice as our discussant. So it's a real pleasure to be here. I also would like to start by thanking the UCSC Research Center for the Americas for supporting our research cluster that we have here at UCSC called Researching and Resisting Brazil's Reactionary Wave. So at least since 2013, we have been scrambling to explain the rise of the far right in Brazil, and more recently, the election of Bolsonaro. In general, I would say these have been discussed as the major propellers of the reactionary wave. So different authors have focused on sexism and misogyny, homophobia, racism, class resentment, religious fundamentalism. I think, in fact, many of these propellers are addressed in the book Precarious Democracy, and I would say they are all equally relevant. What I think in general has been missing from the discussions is an analysis of the role of whiteness in inciting and supporting the reactionary wave. By scrutinizing the significance of whiteness in informing this juncture, I do not seek to simply add another ingredient to the mix, but to examine how whiteness operates in and through each of these propellers, sometimes silently and in other moments vociferously. So I draw on the findings of several recent ethnographies of everyday life in Brazil, not all of which focus explicitly on racial politics, to show how whiteness has been a central factor in Brazil's current juncture. So the major goal of this study is to offer a conceptual contribution that may help to remove whiteness from its privileged position of neutrality and relative invisibility. So in the chapter, I do a quick overview of these four propellers, and then I add what I see as another major propeller, which is whiteness. So I then define whiteness according to critical studies of whiteness that have emerged in Brazil. I then developed my concept of injured whiteness, which I am developing mostly to try to account for the reactionary posture of the middle classes. And then I think about how whiteness operates discursively among the lower classes, and thus the concept of aspirational whiteness. But first, let me just explain why I'm using the coming out metaphor. In the lead up to the second round of the 2018 Brazilian presidential elections, Regina Duarte, whom you see here, one of the country's most famous actresses, explained her support for Jair Bolsonaro as a coming out process. She said, "I was in the closet and my youngest son started questioning me. Since I had always been a democratic, open and fair person, how could I simply accept the idea of Bolsonaro as brute, rough, ignorant, violent? When I met Bolsonaro in person, I encountered a sweet guy, a man from the 50s like my dad, and who makes homophobic jokes, but which is just for show, and with a masculine way of being like that of Monteiro Lobato, who used to call Brazilians lazy and say that the place of Blacks is the kitchen." Long before these words were publicly uttered and published in a major Brazilian newspaper, Estadão, leftist and anti-racist activists were already employing the coming out metaphor to critically refer to the newfound ease with which many middle-class and upper-class Brazilians had begun to make openly reactionary remarks. As we can hear in Regina Duarte's comment, homophobia, sexism, and racism are explicitly intertwined. But what is left unstated is the whiteness of the speaker, as well as that of her father, of Monteiro Lobato, and of the president she helped elect. This concealed and thus quote-unquote neutral whiteness is, however, the very position of power from where these absurdities can be nonchalantly enunciated and rendered acceptable. In general lines, we can think of the major ways in which whiteness has been defined in Brazil. And I want to draw here from some of the pioneers like Maria Aparecida Bento, who defined whiteness as the social identity of whites, as an identity that's neutral, universal. Another pioneer and also a social psychologist, Edith Pisa, defines whiteness as the dominant identity, normative, invisible, preferential. More recent research on whiteness has emphasized that in a country where the narrative of racial democracy has been so dominant, it's important to understand how whiteness operates through registers that are not always explicitly racial, like morality, respectability, discipline, worthiness, intimacy. And I highlight here Valéria Ribeiro Corossax's work and Susanna Myers. I am particularly inspired also by Roth Gordon's definition of whiteness as embodied practices and linguistic discipline. And I want to highlight also the way Richard Miskolci talks about whiteness as an ideal, to which I add that is promoted discursively as a major social value to be preserved, thus the injured whiteness when people feel they are losing it, but also to be acquired by those who do not, and thus the aspirational whiteness. Transversal, I would say, to all of these definitions is the legacy of slavery. In the specific context of Brazil, the ideal of whiteness must be understood in light of this long history of slavery that profoundly shaped Brazilian society, culture, and politics. Slavery was widely disseminated across social strata, and one needed not be wealthy to be a slave owner, characteristic that brought together priests, small property owners, merchants, and even former slaves. The legacy of slavery continues to inform a far-reaching racial hierarchy that encompasses the belief in white superiority and Black inferiority, the association between Blackness and manual labor, and the notion that Black and poor people should know their place, both physically and symbolically, as well as informing the authoritarianism of everyday life. So during the 13 years in which the Workers' Party was in the presidency, significant social changes occurred. Some of them are listed here on the slide, and of course, I won't have time to talk about all of them in this short period of time, but I will highlight that all of these different components were very important in producing what I am calling the injured whiteness. So as a reactionary stance to all of these significant social transformation. In the chapter, I detail how each of these components triggered an injured whiteness. So in general, I would say that similar to the concept of injured masculinity, injured whiteness results from a crisis of a dominant model due to a change in the status quo and a real or perceived loss of power and privilege of the dominant group. The challenge to the long-standing premise that poor and Black people should know their place deeply mobilized the already existing fear of otherness, no longer because the other represented an external threat to the self, but because the other was actually threatening to become the self. Because it was losing power, whiteness became more guarded and as a consequence, more visible during the PT era. More than ever before in the history of Brazil, whiteness was interpolated in the sense that it was increasingly called into place. As the dominant identity, whiteness had more commonly been in the position of interpolating others than being itself interpolated. So these important social changes that occurred during the PT era shifted this condition as it ousted whiteness from its comfortable and powerful position of relative invisibility and neutrality. In other words, I'm using here Cida Bento's very powerful concept of o pacto narcísico da branquitude. The narcissistic pact of whiteness was significantly challenged as more Black people entered what was used to be exclusively white spaces. However, because it operates discursively, whiteness is not restricted to the groups that most directly benefit from it. In fact, although I initially thought that this project would allow me to study up, that is to focus on the middle class backlash against the PT's pro-poor and pro-Black policies, I have come to realize that only a more nuanced study of whiteness that encompasses its appeal across social classes and racial groups may help explain the shocking paradox, and I can never get over this, whereby 45% of Black Brazilians and 64% of Brazilians whose families receive between 2 and 5 minimum wages voted for Bolsonaro. And this is where I think my concept of aspirational whiteness may prove useful. So aspirational whiteness has revolved a lot around the idea of the need for a disidentification from what has been defined as the internal enemy, whether it is the so-called marginal, bandido, the members of social movements like the MTST, the beneficiaries of Bolsa Família and other income distribution programs. So there's been I think fear and disidentification have been crucial in this triggering of aspirational whiteness. So to finalize, I just want to talk about two opposite processes regarding whiteness among the lower classes. So on one hand, a growing desire for whiteness, so what I'm calling aspirational whiteness, grounded on the mobilization of fear, the incentive to consume, prosperity theology, neoliberal subjectivities. But then opposite to that, there has also been a denunciation of white privilege, an overcoming of whiteness as an ideal, and a reclaiming of Blackness as a dignified identity, stimulated by affirmative action and other policies. Looking then at how whiteness, so we can think of opposite processes regarding whiteness among the lower classes, but converging processes regarding whiteness among the middle class. So the middle class has then come out of the closet, both by outing itself And here is one example of a white Brazilian woman protesting against racial quotas in higher education, but also by being outed. And I won't have time to explain here the Casa Grande Surda quando a senzala vira médica, but this has been a very important slogan that has been used to out whiteness, to really push it further out of the closet. Central to both of these processes is that it was no longer possible to remain ignorant of the reality and effects of racism in Brazil. As Eve Cedric argues, ignorance and silence are essential components of discourses, functioning as an epistemological privilege, as they allow the interlocutor who has or pretends to have the less knowledge of a specific issue to define the terms of exchange. The reactionary wave unleashed during the PT era rendered untenable the long-established silence around the country's long history of racism and racial discrimination. While it chose to ignore the effects of racism, whiteness had long established the parameters of the conversation around it. And now that the silence, oblivious denial, and evasion regarding one's position of power are no longer tenable in Brazil, whiteness can no longer function as this unmarked marker and has therefore been left with no other choice than to come out of the closet. So my last paragraph is that if coming out refers to something that is hidden, this expression can only be applied to an identity that is visible and embodied when coming out is not about revealing, but about affirming, and in the case here, confirming one's position of power. The metaphor of the closet has a very different meaning in reference to whiteness than when it applied to an oppressed identity. Coming out as LGBTQ means overcoming shame and liberating from an oppressive heteronormative system, and is therefore a step toward an inclusive society. Whiteness coming out of the closet, on the other hand, is the performative act of reclaiming privilege for those who fear they have lost it, or requesting to partake in it for those who have never had it in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Onwards, our next presentation is from Moisés Copper, who's a postdoctoral research at the Free University of Brussels. The name of his chapter that he'll be presenting pieces from is Withering Dreams, Material Hope, and Apathy Among Brazil's Once Rising Poor. To you, Moisés.
Thank you so much, Benjamin, for introducing me. Thank you also, Paulo, for having us here at the Brazil Institute. It's a pleasure to be at this roundtable along with Patricia and Deborah. My goal in this short presentation is to introduce 2 or 3 ideas I make in the paper in this chapter, while also at the same time giving some contextual signposts about the empirical materials that serve as the basis for my analysis. So my chapter on material hope and apathy among Brazil's once rising poor draws on fieldwork events that took place in early 2017, following 5 years of ethnographic research conducted with beneficiaries of Brazil's largest public housing program, the Minha Casa Minha Vida. In this sense, the chapter is a sequel to my manuscript called Architectures of Hope, in contract with University of Michigan Press. The book tells the story of how communal idealism, electoral politics, and consumer markets converged to make first-time home ownership a reality for millions of low-income Brazilians over the last 12 years. Specifically, Architectures of Hope trails the path of 160 families who came together in 2009 to mobilize for housing in the city of Porto Alegre, southern Brazil. The book documents their efforts to distinguish themselves from failed housing initiatives of the past and also create a sustainable local structure of governance with municipal state agents, participatory budgeting actors, and representatives of public banks and the market. Over 5 years, I followed the political activities and social interactions of these activists as they prepared themselves to move to a middle-class urban environment. I visited potential beneficiaries in their old homes and new apartments, and also I carried out a socio-demographic survey months after they moved in 2015. When I returned to the field in late 2016 and early 2017, expecting to implement a second round of questionnaires, I quickly realized things were different. New infrastructures of surveillance and communication, such as monitoring cameras and intercom systems and even sentry boxes, had been built around the complex, filtering the flux of residents and visitors. Inside the premises, it wasn't easy to find and approach residents who seemed to have suddenly grown uninterested and apathetic. Even leaders were equally absent and hard to locate. As I slowly broke through these obstacles, I grew more and more interested in piecing together the political ambivalence displayed by some of my longtime research interlocutors. What was going on with this community of housing activists, once celebrated for their innovative participation in politics and a will to thrive against all odds? As you may remember, Minha Casa Minha Vida was launched in 2009 with the task of creating millions of jobs in the civil construction industry at a time when Brazil was looking to expand its domestic consumption markets to counteract the devastating effects of the international crisis. By the end of 2016, 4 million beneficiaries had been granted 10-year-long mortgages with monthly payments that amounted to only 5% of their monthly domestic income, something like $33 in 2012. Minha Casa Minha Vida was also critical for the continuation of the Workers' Party in power. Along with the public discourse of a newly defined Brazilian middle class, the promise of housing for all was a star of the PT's re-election campaigns, and more fundamentally, it was the language through which the PT communicated with its constituency. Minha Casa Minha Vida also tested PT's new style of decentralized and post-neoliberal governance. It relied on municipal housing departments to register and select beneficiaries, all the while putting developers in charge of proposing housing projects, a fact that arguably contributed to pushing new initiatives to remote urban peripheries. Urban peripheries were in fact hosts to many of Minha Casa Minha Vida projects across the country, and they were pivotal recipients of the redistributive effects of the PT era policies, which brought access to consumer markets and services to over 40 million low-income citizens. But despite their centrality in the PT's governance model, urban peripheries became heterogeneous political spaces in recent years. This is shown in the evolution of voting behavior between 2002 and 2018, displayed in the graph above for the periphery of São Paulo, which comes from a book on peripheral space my colleagues Matthew, Jacqueline, Valeria, and I edited in 2020. Whereas these voters massively supported the PT in 2002 and 2006, a gradual shift towards the center-right, PSDB, occurred in 2010 and 2014, and then more dramatically toward the far-right PSL in 2018. My colleague Matthew found similar results for the peripheries of Rio, Belo Horizonte, and Porto Alegre. What is more, if we look at the 2018 electoral results by census tracts in areas around the projects in Porto Alegre, we'll find very close results, with the PT candidates performing only slightly better than Bolsonaro on average. So a first important point here is that the changes I observed in my ethnographic forays in Porto Alegre were part of the broader political transformation and heterogenization underway in peripheral space in Brazil. Results from the 2017 survey further reveal how people felt increasingly skeptical and ambivalent towards social institutions and big media, and also unsafe in their immediate surroundings. But such aggregate data doesn't necessarily bring us closer to understanding what happened to post-pink tide political subjectivity. Explanations to this kind of puzzle require fine-grained ethnographic analysis. As I went back to the project and was confronted with apathy and disinterest, I needed to re-examine some of the taken for granted assumptions about the legacies of socioeconomic policies and their role in shaping political subjectivity. I began making sense of Porto Alegre's exceptional case of policy implementation during the years of economic prosperity through the concepts of policy afterlives and material hope. A long-term perspective on policy interventions allows us to see how morality and power shape practices of citizenship and subjectivity, and also placemaking over time. It gives insight into the ways in which people move in and out of these political economic frameworks, waiting, hoping, and envisioning new futures. Material hope, on the other hand, refers to the infrastructures of aspiration and imagination created by housing movements to navigate the political economic temporality of policies on the ground. It involves the sheer materiality of housing itself, but it also encompasses the yearning for a better life as envisioned through the affective aspects of housing. Material hope is a thrust for individual transformation amid changing opportunity structures that allow people to devise meritocratic narratives of worthiness about their past and future. In the context of a faltering economy and a corroded political system, people retrenched to their homes and resorted to apathy to protect their dreams and hopes for upward mobility. Apathy and ambivalence can thus be seen as desperate attempts to avoid falling into a condition I label negative hope, when the socio-material footing that once upheld hope is preempted, and all that is left are unrealizable dreams of upward mobility. Constructions of material hope are evident in the way leaders and residents spoke about their past achievements and future expectations in 2016 and 17. We need this effort documented in pictures and videos because people tend to forget. They are not grateful. I heard from a community member supporting the candidacy of the association's president for a seat in the city council in 2016. The implication in his words was clear. Narrating past achievements wasn't important only for outsiders. It was a critical tool to remind ungrateful homeowners of the collective endeavors that brought them to the projects amid the rapid expansion of evangelical voters who they saw as a threat to the leader's campaign. Or take the words of the president's son, which resonate with many other younger generation residents in the projects. I want to build my own path and not depend on the crumbs from the white middle class. People need good examples and self-esteem to improve their lives. These words reveal orientations of future well-being that emerge out of the texture of everyday mobilization for housing, and that are not rooted in a quest, and that are also rooted in the quest for material improvement. Material hope is about the infrastructures upon which these expectations are ascribed: the apartment, a college degree, the fruits of social programs, but also about the legitimate ways to achieve such well-being through communal mobilization, hard work, individual effort, self-esteem. Material hope furnishes beneficiaries with the tools they need to narrate individual and collective merit. In this sense, material hope goes beyond the wish for something to come true. It is also about resisting negative hope, or the specter of losing control over the ability to attain better futures. Material hope is therefore also the wish for something to remain true. So to conclude, political and economic subjectivities change as the policies and collective infrastructures upholding them disintegrate. However, despite the effects of mounting unemployment, indebtedness, and income losses, political and economic subjectivities are not reset to a state of mind that existed prior to the assembly of material hope. Instead, housing beneficiaries exist in a mental state where their dreams of upward mobility outlast their capacity to act on the future to realize such dreams. They are left to deal with the effects of withering dreams that persist despite faltering economic and political structures. In such a context, building resentment, apathy, ambivalence, or pessimism toward the existing powers is a way to continue exercising control over those hopes, to claim the deeds over accomplished fates, and to assign responsibilities when things go downhill. By doing so, the once rising poor built political subjectivities that were disconnected from partisan politics, from conventional social movements, and from conservative representations of poverty in Brazil. So the question today seems to be, what new projects will once again rebuild those broken hopes from the ashes of destruction in Brazil? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Moises. Actually to both of our chapter authors. So what's going to happen next in just a moment is Professora Deborah Diniz will offer some reflections on the book as a whole. We've really given her the freedom to pick and choose as she wants to. And we're, of course, very grateful and curious. Just to mention to the audience, if you have questions or if you have comments you'd like to make, we'd like to encourage you to use the Q&A feature down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will be, after Professor Diniz has offered her comments, we'll have probably 15 to 20 minutes, hopefully, to look at those questions and also dialogue a bit with each other. But if you have questions, please do type them in to the Q&A box. That would be the most efficient way to do it. And to be clear, I think our audience does not have access to the regular chat box. Please don't use that. If you do, use the Q&A. And then I think that's it. Okay, onwards. So Professora Diniz has already been introduced. She's an anthropologist, law professor, and bioethicist. And we're very grateful to have you here. And I'm happy to pass the floor to you.
Thank you so much, all of you, to have me today in this amazing group. And I'm here doing the propaganda. I think that I'm only one doing that. And I need to tell you, Ben, that I bought my book without the discount. So, but really, guys, it was amazing to have the opportunity to read this book in advance and to have this moment to share with you some, I would say some thoughts and the way that reading the book and thinking about myself and thinking about what we call Brazil at this moment and how it resonates on me. So please feel free to tell me if it makes sense or not. This is a book to be read if you need to understand Brazil now. You don't need to be a Brazilian or someone that does research about Brazil to be worried about what is happening in this country. You just need to be worried about the global politics with the circulation of negative effects on politics to understand Trump, Orban, or Bolsonaro are not just a coincidence in time. They represent an ambivalence of our times. Leaderships with xenophobic narratives about who belongs where, with hyper-masculine voices revamping old patriarchal rules about gender, race, sexualities. They look anachronic when in public. You just need to look at the news of an unvaccinated Bolsonaro forced to eat pizza on a New York sidewalk ahead of UN General Assembly because he refused to comply with indoor dining requirements, or now at the climate summit in Glasgow, in which the president of the country that is home to 60% of the Amazon rainforest is completely isolated and out of touch with reality. But they are more than real and extremely dangerous to local democracies and to our shared values of transnational justice and human rights. As a reader, you have different entry points to think about Brazilian real politics and the politics of life when reading this book. However, I would say a common path cuts across all the chapters. The story is unfolded from the bottom of ordinary lives to the top of the political power, Key actors of the Brazilian politics from 2013 to 2019 are named as part of the holistic picture about the country. But the concrete learnings come from those traditionally erased from the official political narratives, such LGBTI+ leaders, Brazilian Japanese migrants in Japan, or the family of Luzimar, a Northeastern woman and her intergenerational struggles about politics. The book has a common statement: Brazilian democracy is now precarious. This could be understood as inherent to our weak and young Latin American democratic states after decades of military dictatorship, humanitarian crisis, or health emergencies like Zika and COVID. But I would say there is more than a shared fate to what is happening in Brazil. It is an induced precarity caused by multiple factors. And the book is not simplistic in pointing out only to Bolsonaro as the cause. He is the tipping point of years of conservative revival. That is why this is not just a book that is not a book just about Bolsonaro. It is a book about the mixed effects of hope, despair, and resistance in response to the negative effects brought into circulation with the emergence of the right wing to power. Our patriarchal, racist, colonial roots require more exploration to help us to understand what is happening among us. This book offers us some elements in that direction. The 16 chapters, from masculinity performances to anti-corruption narratives, embrace the complexity of how precarity expresses itself in daily lives. Precarious Democracy is a compound name to understand Brazilian society nowadays. We live under a precarious democracy. As a Brazilian, and in a very particular way, affected by the brutality of those in power, it's not an easy task to think about us in such terms. It's a descriptive concept, but it's also a call for action. Precarious democracies is not our destiny. We can recognize our shared precarities to build what the book announces as a hope, and to move away from the sense of despair or pessimism. If I'm right in understanding precarity as an ethical interpellation as well, the dispute is also about who tells the story of what is happening in front of us right now. The book is set in what is sometimes called a post-pink tide era. And as a feminist, I could not avoid to make the parallel with the green wave that is coming from Argentina, and will be my final remark. And this post-pink tide refers to the early 2000 years when many Latin American governments challenging neoliberal models and took a left-wing turn towards more progressive economic and social policies. More than referencing a time period, it seems to me that the post-pink tide concept tends to point to a potential explanation in the book. In that sense, the conservative, authoritarian rising we are living through in the region now would be partly a backlash, and the book uses this concept of backlash response by the hegemonic powers to the progressive policies. However, there is always when we speak about backlash, we are challenging who tells the story and to whom. Because backlash, we commonly use this concept to talk about progressive movements, and quite rarely we use to describe the authoritarian movements and those that are now in power in Brazil. So I wonder if the backlash narrative is a good concept to us, and what is the explanatory, if there is any power in it, because it sounds that any social transformation that comes too fast to the colonial, racist, patriarchal roots of Brazil will be followed by a threat of saying there will be serious consequences against you if you try to move in that way. And my question is, we are not moving too fast, right? So what does it mean when we use this concept of backlash to talk about what is happening among us and this force and counter movement against oppression? And I would conclude saying, let's look at gender and reproductive rights issues as an example. The book is the book embraces the narratives about sexuality and race more than about reproductive issues, right? More than about feminist issues. And abortion and gender justice are part of any democratic rebuild, but we keep assuming them as sensitive and difficult issues. We saw this happen in the Pink Tide, and it's also somehow reflected in the book, which has at least 3 chapters dedicated to sexual justice, resilience, and resistance, but no clear discussion about reproductive rights in a country that was the epicenter of the first public health emergency of this century. And also the country that is one of the center of the anti-gender ideology that is several times mentioned in the book. I'm concluding. The green wave that decriminalized abortion in Argentina is a good example. In the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, in an unexpected moment, the criminal law was lifted. I could give you some examples from the feminist movement in Brazil as well at this moment. The green wave advances do not fit in a post-Pink Tide backlash narrative. And I think this is where it shines an inspiring light also for reading this book. Precarious democracies are not a given or necessary stage in a linear path towards a more just future for everyone. Precarious democracies are a contingency of our struggles to dispute white supremacist, patriarchal, extractivist, and neoliberalist hegemony. And there also can be a potential space for hope, for change through our shared precarities. Thank you. And a good journey for the book.
Thank you so much, Professora Deborah, for all of your comments. So what happens next is we've received a handful of questions for our presenters, and I'm going to deliver them. And again, if you have a question, the best thing is to type it in, and we'll get to it that way, and we'll just do them in order. So here we go. The first question is from João Sodré, a PhD candidate at Georgetown University, who asks a question for Professor Pinho. He writes, many activists in Brazil use branquitude as a synonym for pessoas brancas, whereas in the academy, whiteness has an ideological character, among other traits you have emphasized. How will you reflect this in the Portuguese version of the book?
Thank you so much for the question. Before I answer the question, I just want to thank Deborah for her really insightful comments and to also reiterate what I think is a very important critique about evolutionist understandings of history, right? Because when the coup against Dilma took place, we could not help but use evolutionist language, right? So it was all about retrocesso, atraso, passos para trás. That language was kind of unavoidable, but I think it's very important that we remain vigilant about how inherently masculinist evolutionist language actually is, right? And that we try to think of more creative ways of understanding historical unfoldings, because we are not really at all on a linear path towards progress, that's for sure. It's really much more about flux and reflux than anything else. So yeah, the question about branquitude, yes, in the chapter, I do talk about how I am using branquitude as the translation for whiteness and vice versa. And I think both in critical studies of whiteness in the US, as well as estudos críticos de branquitude no Brasil, both of these frameworks are thinking of branquitude, yes, as in part about phenotype, about embodied whiteness, no doubt, but it's also about symbolic capital. It's also about social value. And one is not more important than the other, but I think it's very enriching to understand how whiteness also operates discursively, because it's only once we understand the discursive nature of whiteness that we can really grasp why it has an appeal for those who are not embodied as white. Right. So yes, this is not to emphasize the symbolic value of whiteness or whiteness as symbolic capital or social value, is not at all to deny the embodied power of whiteness, but it's really to show that it's only through understanding the discursive part of it that we can see how it circulates beyond white bodies, basically, beyond those who benefit directly, explicitly from having white bodies, whether in Brazil or in the United States. And of course, always taking into consideration the local racial configurations. So yeah, I wanted to just emphasize that it doesn't deny the embodied nature of whiteness, but that's not all that whiteness is about. And it's through the discursive component that it circulates and becomes appealing to those who are not embodied as white. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Great. The next question is a big question, and I think it's directed to any of our presenters or commentator. If you want to respond, you can, but you don't have to. So here's the question. It's from Bob Chapman. The question is there a parallel between the US and Brazil, given the relationship between the Trump family and the Bolsonaro family and public policy? That's the question. And I just want to highlight, I don't think this question is asking, is Bolsonaro the Trump of the tropics, which I think is a narrative that all of us tend to push against. I think it's asking specifically about the family and where, Bolsonaro's family and Trump's family, if there's a parallel vis-a-vis public policy. So maybe Deborah, if you want to have the first pass, you're welcome to, and then anyone else can.
It's a very good question, right? And the book, in your chapter, Ben, that discuss the centrality of the idea of family to try as a lens to understand what is happening in Brazil, the patriarch, he operates by this idea of protecting one idea of family. So it's not just a coincidence that we have a patriarchal way of doing politics in Latin America and in Brazil in particular, that we have this, I would say, ecosystem of masculinity and hate, that we have like gender, race, and sexuality is at the core of what Bolsonaro means in Brazil. And of course, this idea of my family, the family of the patriarch. And somehow this is with a different social and historical roots, that we can think about those two very brutal leaders in a way that they put family and their blood-related members connected to national politics. I would say that the person that raised the question has a very good frame to think and to make comparisons about with the two. But I would say that you are the best person here to respond about how family is connected to it.
Well, I will offer some thoughts. Thank you for signaling my chapter in the book, which does get into this idea. So my chapter is about a particular family that I only describe with pseudonyms, but I'm still very much in touch with them, and I'm writing about them. And it's a situation that I think many Brazilians of different classes are familiar with, which is that, you know, there's someone in the family who was at the time of the elections very supportive of Bolsonaro. There's an evangelical in the family, and there's a young student who benefited from the affirmative action programs. All of these, you know, all of these have given rise to different tensions, intergenerational tensions, tensions around gender, sexuality, cultural memory. And I do explore this idea that I think I'll offer a provocation, and we can, Deborah, you've already stated that some sense of a lost patriarchy may have been a part of Bolsonaro's appeal in 2018. And I want to offer a provocation, which is, as an anthropologist, I understand that. You know, it is true that how a man should behave in the world became much more complicated under the PT period. Necessarily, and according to my politics, I support that, but it is a fact that that gender, sexuality, the possibilities for identity, behavior, naming yourself, political voice became diversified in an unprecedented manner. And I understand that that is threatening and unsettling to not just men, but, you know, it can be unsettling. And I'm not willing to argue that that men, you know, male citizens in Brazil voted for Bolsonaro because he's a strong kind of male masculine figure. I think that's too heavy-handed, but there is something there. And I think that's all I'll say for now. We can of course talk more about this particular issue if we want to, but I want to give Patricia and Moises a chance to, if they want to talk about this issue of Trump family, Bolsonaro family. If you want to, you're welcome to. Moises, you want to go first?
Yeah, I was going to suggest, in addition to what you were saying, which is really interesting, that maybe the link of masculinity, so to speak, could be the way those paternal figures garnered ideals of hope in this different context, in the sense that the kinds of communities and demographics that they were actually galvanizing in order to perform certain ideals of leadership, traditional, conventional values embedded in those performances, and also projects of leading the hopes of those wide conservative classes that were, like Patricia was saying earlier, that were relegated and that kind of like came out of the closet during those years building up to the 2018 election. So I think maybe thinking in terms of the linkages and the scales at which those ideals of family were scaled up in terms of projects of garnering and spreading hope ideals, it's an interesting form of bringing those different scales together. Beyond that, I was going to also just touch on potentially the idea that there are other connections, actual connections between the families that kind of rely on the technological aspects of doing politics in 21st century, such as the use of robots or fake news and the kinds of digital infrastructures and the organizers of those digital infrastructures and the systems and the infrastructures behind those systems that are interlinked in the back of those of what we see and document ethographically in terms of values and family relations. So I think, and that's usually less talked about in as far as the elements that led to the conservative turn, so to speak. But I think it's also very important to see what kind of hidden human elements behind those more than human machineries of power are actually orchestrating or connecting those dots in very specific ways to perform power.
Patricia, did you want to add anything to this about the question of family?
Yeah, just very briefly, just really a thought on the importance of injury again, right? Because similar to injured whiteness, this is very much about injured masculinity as well. But what I think is important to consider here is that men are not the only ones fighting to control, the traditional family ideal. And in fact, what I think really needs more research, and I want to highlight the research of someone like Flavia Biroli, for instance, right? At Winnipeg, that looks at how women have been at the forefront of the activism to protect the traditional family against, LGBTQ people, against the PT and all of these supposed enemies. So I think we really need to pay attention to those who we think as being kind of it's counterintuitive, right, for women to be at the forefront of this kind of activism, but we know that this is what is happening. So I just wanted to, point out the complexity of who ends up being at the front lines of the defense of the traditional family, basically.
Okay, great. There are a couple of other comments, but I'm going to insert something that I'd love to hear what my colleagues have to say. So in the social sciences, there is a tendency to describe what's happening in Brazil, what has happened and is happening elsewhere in Latin America, elsewhere in the world, as sometimes terms like the global embrace of conservative populism, or Brazil's rightward turn, or the kind of the spread of conservative ideology in Brazil. And I think, like many of us, I tend to think against a little those narratives for describing what's happening. And it hasn't come up yet in our event today, but I remind everyone that unlike the United States, where you don't have to vote, in Brazil you do have to vote, with minimal consequences if you don't. But most eligible Brazilian voters do vote. And in 2018, most eligible voters did not vote for Bolsonaro. 60% of the eligible electorate either voted for the PT candidate, they abstained, or they voted in blank. And so with that in mind, and of course, to understand how Bolsonaro won, you have to know a bit about how the electoral system works in Brazil. When it came down to the second election at the end of October 2018, Bolsonaro had the majority compared to his opponent, so he won. But in fact, he won with a minority of votes. And I think, from my perspective, that challenges the notion of that conservative political subjectivity took over Brazil. And I noticed, Moises, you brought up the concept of ambivalent political subjectivities. And I'm just curious if any of you have, for your reflections on, is what we're seeing the spread of conservative subjectivity? Is it ambivalence? What terminology, how do you reflect on whatever forms of political subjectivity seem to have taken root across Brazil in recent years? To be fair, I know that's a big question, but it seems pertinent. It's what we're all grappling with in this book, each in our own way. To be democratic, we'll just go back to Deborah. I think if you want to reflect, you're welcome to.
Thanks, Benja. I think that the issue here is that when we use political parties or official political power as a proxy to explain what is happening in a country in a historical time. And it was a decision of our conversation in part of the book to think about what you call PT era. So you have this proxy trying to put a lens, light to something. And the history at the same time that is much longer than that. And we have other proxies to look at it. For me, I really, my lens to understand what is happening in Brazilian society is throughout the lens of power. And when we speak about patriarchy or racism, for me, it's not about identities. It's about power imbalance and power structures and mechanisms of oppression. So what we saw with Bolsonaro, as I said, as a tipping point, as a public figure about making a narrative about those systems of oppression and power, that is not new in Brazilian society. So it's a long-lasting narrative, and we saw that we discussed it about slavery, that we discussed colonial, structures. So depending on the lens that we use and the concepts that we use to think about what is happening, I would say that it can be a turn because we have, fragmented time. It can be a long-lasting struggle that I would put women at the forefront, even having women like our Minister of Human Rights and Women, that is a patriarchy embedded in a woman's body. We do have women at the forefront of challenging Brazilian society.
Moises.
Yeah, thank you, Benjamin, for this great question. I think one way of responding to it would be to break down the idea of ambivalence into different parts, perhaps starting with the kind of popular political concept of disinterest in politics, which is kind of the question anthropologically would be the question of how do constituencies or the poor negotiate their political preferences during election times, and how more broadly do they take or not interest in politics. And I think that's also, to go back to Deborah's point, that's something that kind of is a long-lasting debate, and it's also something that is part of how, for example, in my case, housing beneficiaries engaged in politics over the years. So the question of how they negotiated their political transition to a more center politician back in 2016 and then 2018, perhaps even farther towards the far right. That's a question that goes back into, well, how do they organize politically to support their own leaders, who were also candidates at some point, as I said earlier, for the city council and so on. And throughout those different candidacies, we're also shifting parties as the parties in the city or in specific politicians were also shifting. So the president of the Housing Association that I talked about, for example, in the beginning, when Porto Alegre was still a hotspot of the PT government, she was, of course, affiliated to the PT. But then when things changed in 2004 and a coalition of parties led by the PMDB took power, she, of course, also then reaffiliated herself to PMDB. She ran with PMDB as her first time for city councillor in 2012, and then later in 2016 she shifts again to the PTB. Along this process, of course, the entourage of assisting leaders and, of course, some other engaged members in the community also shift parties. So it's a process of negotiation that doesn't foreground necessarily ideological preferences. It's mostly about how popular politics are done on the ground and what place broad interest in politics does not occupy in this process. So to talk about interest in politics and by extension ambivalence as a political subjectivity element, we would have to really look like zooming into specifically what are the conjunctures and elements taking place and shaping politics at a certain moment. So in which context did those transitions of voting preference take place? To what specific questions were people who were voting or not for Bolsonaro responding at a time? What were they actually doing when they were voting for him or not? And so what is the meaning of those political engagements through votes beyond the more like political question of interest or disinterest in politics? So I think anthropology has a lot to say by looking into those empirical ethnographic terrains of what goes on the ground and how politics and power more broadly, as Deborah was saying, becomes an important variable shaping those subjectivities at those different moments in time.
Patricia, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I'll make two quick comments. One is to think about, again, bringing masculinity into the framework, right? And I won't really develop this, but I think it is important that we consider the role played by masculinity in terms of the political figures, right? Because we know that a lot of people who voted for Bolsonaro would have voted for Lula, but not for Haddad. So there's something about different models of masculinity here that need to be really unpacked. But going back to your question, Ben, about whether this is a right-wing turn, etc., I really like, water metaphors way more than those rooted in soil. So, maré, onda, wave, I think those are a way more fluid metaphors, so therefore there's more room for change in them. So I think wave does make a lot of sense. It is a neoconservative wave, because I think what's empowering in terms of thinking of waves is that waves come and go, but then sometimes waves can be tsunamis, right? Waves can really drown us, which is, I think, what has been happening since Bolsonaro was elected. And then I would just remind us all of a very sharp analysis by Jean Willis when he says fear was really the guiding element in this election, and different kinds of fear were used to mobilize different kinds of constituencies, right? So let's use the fear of LGBTQ people, the fear that religious fundamentalists have, or the fear of feminists, or, for the middle class, the fear of the social ascension of Black people or of poor people in general. So I think that in a way it was a kind of coalition of different kinds of fears, really, that sustained this wave that ended up electing Bolsonaro. But then again, waves come and go. So, and hopefully he's gonna, be taken away in the next tide.
So thank you very much for all of those remarks. So we're hitting the home stretch of our event. We just have a few more minutes. I want to acknowledge there have been some comments that aren't really questions, but they're interesting comments. For example, Carl Kendall has mentioned his memories of this period, leading up to the 2018 elections, reflection that people in Brazil were scared about the economic future, some sense that PT economic policies had not delivered the goods, and that some sense that disaster was coming, and that was what guided political, behavior. Some other nice, generous comments. There are a few people who have asked our panelists what they think needs to happen in the next year. I want to add one final question as well, and we'll just let we'll do one more round, and anyone, each of you can say what you want. But I want to add to this the question of cultural memory. And we know that part of, we haven't talked about it much today, but we know in many of the book chapters and in our own discussions and experiences that ways of remembering not only the dictatorship, the 60s, 70s, and 80s in Brazil, but also the PT years, came into play in unexpected, uneven, and sometimes seemingly contradictory ways. And it seems that ways of remembering the past, even if you weren't alive during the dictatorship, are very much a part of the story. And I wanted to take that to thinking to turn that forward and say, you know, with the likely election between Lula and Bolsonaro, memory of the PT years is going to come back into, you know, onto the scene. And I wonder if this will be good for Brazilian democracy. So there are lots of ways you could respond to that. Those are big themes and questions, but it seems like possibly a nice way to wind down. Why don't we go in reverse order? Patricia, if you'd like to go first. Anything in there that just came up, it's up to you what you'd like to respond to.
Wow, that's such an important question. And I think you're absolutely right, Ben. It is very much about memory and how we are going to be representing what the PT era, to use that expression again, was, and the dispute over that, you know. So, and something we haven't really talked much about, even though the book does a great job doing so, is talking about social media and the role that social media will play in constructing this recent social memory. So all I can say is it's going to be a very, very intense dispute, which will, I think, ultimately decide the election. That's what I can say right now.
Moving to Moises next, my apologies. We have to kind of be in soundbite mode here. So you have about a minute or two.
Thank you, Ben, for this awesome question also. I think I was just going to go back really to one of my points I was making in the presentation about negative hope, which is really about the building up of expectations during the PT years in terms of sprawling the limits of governance, of policies, and including a large number of people, but also raising expectations and hopes that those things were achievable for a majority of low-income citizens, when sometimes those policies would fall short of those expectations, that they would leave people outside. So there is bitterness, there is revenge, and there is all sorts of apathy building into in that space of raised expectations and then broken hopes and broken promises. And also in the ways even beneficiaries of some of those policies were critical about the ways they were implemented or felt abandoned by the structures of power after they were implemented, because they found themselves all of a sudden dealing with unforeseen problems like indebtedness or even other like new moral dilemmas in their everyday life. So I think how negative hope, those broken expectations, affects political agency is also a key determinant for the next elections, and it will play an important role in that.
Great. Deborah, apologies that you only have a minute and a half.
Okay, I thought it would be 30 seconds. I would say, Ben, that I'm sure that Bolsonaro will run for a second term. And the second one, for me, it's a question mark, who will be at this stage, just not to forecasting anything. And your question about what we are going to testify, to remember about what Bolsonaro did with us, I will be at the forefront disputing the right memory about COVID pandemic, about the end of Bolsa Familia. So this, for me, will be my agenda setting to be someone at the political space at the forefront.
All right. An ominous ending of our conclusion to our event. So my thanks to all of our presenters, especially to Professora Deborah Diniz for joining us and giving us your wisdom and your reflections, and also to the Wilson Center for International Scholars, especially to Paulo Sotero for supporting me. And I think the last word is his, if you'd like to close the event.
Yes, Ben, I do, and to thank you very much, to thank Patricia, Moises, Deborah, and to thank two people that made this happen. They are Barbara Chimachi, the program assistant, and the intern of this, our current intern, Jared Waters. Thank you all, and let's stay in touch. I'm no longer at the Wilson Center other than a fellow writing things and back in my space as a journalist, but happy to put people together and to continue this conversation. Next year will be fundamental. Every year is fundamental, but the polarization of the political game in Brazil may take us to a very, very ugly place. I hope I'm wrong. I fear that I may be right. Ben, thank you very much, my friend. Stay safe.
Thank you, everyone. All the best.